Calgary UX is proud to partner with Adobe and brings a series of Adobe XD workshops with Matt Rae. Matt is a designer advocate and XD instructor for Adobe, based in Waterloo, Canada. He has a passion for user experience and developing the design community. For this initial workshop, Matt will teach us the basics of how to use Adobe XD and make the most of it.
It's going to do nothing. If you click on here, it's going to show your sync status. So that's going to change based on whether you're connected to the cloud or not. This arrow would normally show your versions. It might not be cooperating with me tonight. On the right, you have an invite link, and this is where you can invite people to your document. If it's cloud-based, that means they can co-edit live with you in the document. This is a little preview for devices, so you can plug in your phone, view it in live, real-time preview on an iOS or Android device. And then this is the play button that opens up your preview window. I'll also try and go through some keyboard shortcuts, but we can get into those later as we get past the basics. And then this is just one more zoom control that you can use. On the right, this is called our property inspector. So you're going to see this change as we move through design mode and prototype mode and share mode. So I'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we dive into those sections. But the other thing you'll notice, and I'll point out right now, is that even this menu in design mode is contextual. So depending on what you have selected, in this case, a shape, my transform and appearance controls show up. And when I select text, I'm going to get my text box and text controls. So I'm not kind of wading through a bunch of menu items that are irrelevant to me at the time. And then down in the bottom left, we have three panes that you can open up. The first one is libraries. And this is where you're going to store all of your assets like character styles, components, which we'll get into. You can add videos into XD and they'll show up in your asset panel. And then you can store your colors here. So I have one gradient added into this asset panel. And as we get into styling, I'll show you a little bit more about how these can be used. And then what every design tool needs is a layer menu. And this also is contextual. So here you see all of the artboards that are laid out on this canvas. And once I click into an artboard here, like if I click on this, you're going to see that goes down a level and shows me everything that's included in that artboard. I have basic controls here, like marking an asset for export. So let's say I wanted to export a logo. I can click on this, and then I can do things like batch exports, and it's going to find all of those, export them. And this is also helpful for when we share to development later on. In share mode, all of my assets that are marked like this can go and be shared to development teams. I can also easily drag to reorder. I can lock elements, and I can hide them as well. So all of those controls are here. Pretty much all of those controls also have keyboard shortcuts when you get to that point and feel comfortable learning keyboard shortcuts. So I think that's everything. Home just takes you back to this home screen. That doesn't necessarily help you too much, but if you're trying to open a new file or something, you can access that there. There are some very basic preferences located in the menu on Mac, like switching your language, showing productivity tips, and creating links when sharing, which we can talk about. You'll probably see some productivity links show up as we're going through the demo. So as I hold on repeat grid, you'll see these show up. And this is a nice quick link into your Learn Hub where you can learn more about, oh boy, it's the wrong window. Where you can learn more about all of the features in XD. And I'm not going to get to that, am I? Where is it? There it is. There we go. So that'll open a video. But if you want to learn more about XD beyond what we're going to cover today and in the next sessions, you can go to adobe.com/learnxd. And that's going to take you to our full Learn Hub with resources for absolutely anything you want. So learning how to share to Behance, designing a gaming platform with Howard Pinsky, some really advanced stuff there, creating social video sharing apps. There's a whole bunch you can learn here, both workflow-based and feature-based. And
So Matt, We just have a question here from Myrna. She's asking, why do we need layers and what does contextual mean?
Great question. So I think why we need layers might be more of an existential question for designers as a whole, but layers are really just a way for us to look into the artboard here. And these are different than like if you've used Photoshop, which may be a bit more advanced. Layers kind of almost started in Photoshop. And it's a way to see all the different elements of your design. And so at its core, layers really show us what's on an artboard. And now the order of the layers tells us the hierarchy of the elements. And so right now, you can't really tell because everything kind of looks flat. But over here, well, let's say, what's a good example? If I pull in this logo, which is the same color, let me change this text. That'll give us some examples. So here in red, I have this title, and you can see it in the layers panel down here. It's the second from the background, which is this rectangle. So I'll just name that background. Great. So this title's on top of the background. Then I have this layer called decorations. And if I toggle that on and off, you're going to see these are the cool little decorations that are a part of this. And so if I was to drag those decorations over top of the title, they're going to show up above it because they're above the title in the hierarchy in the layers. And if I was to move these decorations down below the title, they're going to show up below. So at its core, layers is a really easy way to kind of stack your elements. So if you think of everything like sheets of paper on a desk, your layers are those sheets of paper. And as you move them around, they're going to change the appearance of the elements on the page. Now, this is also where you can group elements. So you see here, decoration shows up as a folder. And that's because I've taken all of these different elements, all these different circles, and I've grouped them together. And this allows me to move them together, rename them, hide and show them all as one entity. So that's really just like an organizational practice. Now, the bigger question is, do you name your layers or not? And as we get into prototyping, I'm going to show you why it's beneficial to name your layers. But as you can see, I'm not well practiced in that habit in this example. But it can be helpful as you get into really big designs to name your layers, or at least name your groups so that you know what elements you're moving around. And this also becomes helpful later on as we get into components and reusable elements. So hopefully that clears things up, Myrna. If not, let me know and I'll expand on it some more. Contextual basically means that this panel is changing based on what you have selected. So in this case, I have text selected, so it's going to show me the relevant tools like text controls for that. Once I go to shapes, text doesn't matter because there's no text here. So it's only giving me appearance and layout controls. And speaking of layout controls, we can move on to layout controls. We'll zoom in here. I apologize, I'm going to milk my voice along here with some tea. So if I take awkward pauses, that is why. So one of the kind of first pieces of a design here, and to clarify and go back, XD's main purpose and focus is really around kind of screen design, website design, even email design, and marketing design, things like ads, display ads, emails, websites, mobile apps. And XD was kind of spun out of this idea of seeing designers in Photoshop designing websites in Photoshop. And I mean, Photoshop, you can do absolutely everything that you can think of, but it's a little complex. And so XD took all the key pieces of the workflow of designing for screens and interactive screens and put them all in here. And so the base of that is layout controls. And this is everything to do with like laying out a framework for our design. So as we get started in the next session, I guess, we're going to start with layout. And that just helps us kind of put our content in the right place and use some mathematics of sorts to make sure everything looks visually spaced out and nice and even. And so a common thing you might hear is people using 8-pixel or 16-pixel grids. And that's just like a method of spacing things out. There's also responsive grids, column grids, a whole bunch of different ways of laying out content and saying, this is the space I have to work with. And this is how I'll distribute my items across the design. And those grids can be important as you move from web to mobile and different device sizes. It can just help you kind of calculate how things should change. And so this is just, we're not going to dive into that. So don't feel overwhelmed. We're just going to go through the layout controls that are available in XD and how you can work with them. So what I have selected here is an artboard. It's kind of stylized. I have some designs on it right now because I got carried away with branding the presentation. But you're normally going to start with a basic blank artboard, and it's going to look like this. So this is an artboard. Right now, you can see I have it sized as a presentation, kind of monitor 16:9 size. But when you create new artboards, you're going to be greeted with a number of different presets here. So you can select different device sizes, iPhones, Android phones, web, and then social media kind of posts as well as watches. So you can use these and start your screen design on a template. You can also set custom designs or custom sizes, sorry, to fit the need that you want. There's so many different screen sizes now, it's fully custom. Now, there's some cool things that you can do in the actual transform panel. And let's see, I'm not gonna be able to scroll in, am I? No. Oops. So let's say that I want to quickly change the size of my artboard. You can manually go in and type in width and height. So I could go say, this is going to be 300 by 1080. But let's say you want to quickly divide something. You say, well, this is great, but it's twice the size I want it to be. You can also use mathematical equations here in your inputs. So here I've just done divide by 2, and I can change it, and XD will handle that calculation for me. So that applies to any of your transform fields. You can change X position, Y position, and X and Y are just where this is on the screen. So here you can see this shape is at X 199, and that's relative to the top left corner of the screen. So if I was to increase this to 300, you're going to see it move in. And if I move this to 400, it's going to move down. So positive is down and to the right, negative is up and to the left. Now, you have some other basic transform tools here like rotation, where you can manually input those rotation. You can flip horizontally and vertically these shapes. Diamond's a terrible shape to demonstrate that on. So let me just change it a little bit. And there, now you can see how that's flipping. We'll get to the rest in a little bit. But all of these controls are also controllable on the canvas. So here I can just click and drag in the top corner until I see that curved arrow shape, and I can manipulate that. If I hold shift, that's going to fix me to a value of, I think it's like 15 pixels on rotation. Yeah. And so I can do that. And let's just reset this back to 0. And I can also use my keyboard shortcuts to move elements around. So my arrow keys, zoom in so you can actually see what I'm doing. My arrow keys here will move me along 1 pixel at a time. And by default, if I hold shift and arrow keys, that's going to jump it around 10 pixels at a time. Now, if I add in here on a Mac command or on Windows, I believe it's control, shift and arrow keys. Now I can resize elements using keyboard controls. So I can easily adjust things. Command and arrow keys will get me that 1 pixel control. And so I have all this fine tuning control right on my keyboard. But of course I can resize it here as well. And the nice thing is with XD is I can get some nice relative measurements right on the canvas. So here you can see that as I move this, I'm going to get these kind of key in points where my position matches up with other shapes. So that's really handy for positioning. Now, going back to that shift control and moving shapes and resizing shapes, we have 1 pixel, and then if you hold shift, you get 10 pixels. But if we go back to that comment about pixel grids, you might want to adjust how that works. And let's say you're working on an 8 pixel grid and you say, Matt, I want to move my shape by 8 pixels, not 10. Well, this is how you do it. So with the artboard selected, you come down to this grid section in the design panel, toggle it on, and you're going to be met with a layout grid. This is kind of also known as a column grid, great for responsive design. We don't want that for this. We're going to go to the square grid, and you can see that here I have my square grid set up to 8 pixels. So when I do that, rather than the 10 pixel movement, if I hold shift and an arrow key, my shape is going to begin snapping to that grid and moving in 8 pixel increments. So this is just a way to kind of cheat the system. If I was to go and make this 16, you can see now I have a bigger grid, and it's going to snap and adjust to that grid as well. And if you don't want the actual grid showing up, but you want to maintain that functionality, you can just go in and change the color and drop that opacity right down. And now your grid has vanished, and you still have the functionality, and your shapes are still going to snap to that grid as you move them around. Now, a final, I'm going to turn it off because I don't want it. Now, if you're quickly doing something, and I use these tools quite a bit, let's say I want to set something up in the middle, and I kind of want it to be 950 pixels, but I want all of my content to fit from this line down on the rest of the page. If I hover off to the left of an artboard, you can see you might not be able to see on the projector, but I get a little light bar on the side. And if I click, I can drag in a guide. And you're going to see here up on the top, I have relative measurements to the edges of the page. And this is really helpful for helping me place it. So let's say I know I need kind of an edge of my page at 330 pixels. I can drag one in. And then over here, I can do the same and drag it into 330. And then from the top, I can bring in my horizontal guides. And let's say I know I'm going to build in a nav bar that's about 60 pixels. I can drag that in and then kind of set my content. And everything's going to snap to these guides really nicely. So you get really precise positioning. That's a fun tongue twister too, if you are bored. So that's guides. Now I can copy and paste these guides. Let's say I've set it up on one page. How do I copy it to the next artboard like this one? Well, I can select this artboard. I can go up to my view mode, select guides, copy guides, select the artboard or multiple artboards that I want it to apply to, and then go back to that menu and select paste guides. And just like that, now those guides show up on my other artboards. And there's some keyboard shortcuts if you go into the view menu to hide all your guides, so just Command semicolon. And I use that a lot to just kind of toggle things back on and off so that the guides don't get in the way of my design. And I'm realizing I need to hurry up a little bit. How are we doing on pacing? Is everyone following along? I see there's a question here. Learning Figma through YouTube, they're similar. Your preference, what will happen to Figma? The question, yeah. So Greg, I can only say so much. I only know so much. I know pretty much as you do. We don't know yet. The plan or what you've heard in the news is really just intent to purchase. And based on that communication, Figma will still exist. As said in the announcement, that's all I know. So yeah, I mean, we're on the same page on this one. I think there's going to be some really cool connections into the rest of Creative Cloud in the future, but we can really only speculate at this point. XD will still be supported at this point, which is why we're doing this. And it's a great tool. I really like using it. I've spent the last like 4 or 5 years on it. So I don't really have a great answer to that question at this point, but they are similar and they're both great tools. And they both have some strengths and weaknesses to each other. When we get into prototyping, I personally think XD's prototyping is really, really good. And so I'm excited to share that with you. But when you look at overall all of the design tools, there's a lot of similarities between them, a lot of borrowed styles and functionality. So they're really all trying to solve similar problems, just a little bit differently. And Brooklyn, that's a good question. There's different standards. There's not necessarily a standard for navbar height. I'd point you to things like the Apple Human Interface guidelines on material design. There are some bigger companies that have kind of set some rough standards. Really what it comes down to is make sure you're designing for your audience and the use case. So I've worked in several different industries with different users, and what one group needs is very different from what another group needs. So designing products for, say, a manufacturing line or automation in a factory, it's gonna be a lot different than designing for teachers and designing for early adopters or a younger audience that's working on their phone. So you really need to kind of take into consideration your audience. I kind of default to 60-ish for website nav bars, but that's something that you can go through and use the inspect mode on Chrome and just kind of check out some of your favorite sites and see what they're using. Okay, we're already at 8:30, so I'm going to try and keep chugging along. Keep the questions coming though. You're probably going to really like this one. So part of layout is in web design, beyond the header and even the header across multiple pages, we do a lot of repeating of elements. And so when you look at any website, you're probably seeing a pile of cards or squares or circles. Really basic shapes is kind of the backbone of a website. And those shapes have content on top of them, like titles and subtitles. And we just reuse those and kind of change the style or change the text content within. Ooh. And so one of the early on features in XD was really seeking out to make that faster and easier to do. And so repeat grid is probably going to be one of your best friends. So here we have a square with a title and subtitle. I could easily copy this and paste it using Command C, Command V, the basics. But what happens if I'm kind of iterating through my design, which we're going to do? You never really ship the first version you design. You're going to kind of lay it out and then say, oh, I want to shrink this title a little bit. The subtitle should be medium maybe, and maybe that should be, let's say 36. So now I've adjusted the design on this first one, but this one hasn't applied it. So now I have to either delete this and copy it. Thankfully with XD, I can copy an element and paste its appearance, which helps. I could keep doing that. But now every time I make a change, I have to copy and paste those styles. And so what we can do is we can select this element and instead go to repeat grid up in the top right. And when I toggle that on, I'm going to get a couple handles. And all I need to do to repeat these elements is drag this out, just like that. And you'll see here in this pink area, that's my spacing. So now that I have three elements, I want to adjust them so that they kind of fill the page properly, and say my spacing is going to be 96. That's great. So now we're back to where we were after we copied and pasted. But we did that faster, arguably, than copying and pasting 3 times. So now if I go in and start modifying my design, you're going to see that that design starts changing across all of the tiles. So even if I go in and start manipulating this cool gradient, I'm going to twist it around maybe. You can see that applying in all of the cards at the same time. So that's super handy for quickly repeating elements. Now, we'll get into this too as we get a little further in. I don't have anything set up. But you can also drop in bulk images and text files into these elements and it's going to fill it across the grid. So stay tuned for that magic, or look it up on adobe.com/learnxd and get a sneak peek. One of my favorite layout controls or tools, which again, we'll get into as we get going, this is just a quick intro, is stacks and padding. And when you're trying to do some really basic kind of content layouts, you might be iterating or changing the way your page is laid out as you go. And this is common with different website sections. So you might start with an about me, let's say, and then you have your work, and maybe you want to easily swap around your work projects. In order to do that, you can use something called stacks. So here I have this basic shape again. If I paste that and paste it again, I could have used repeat grid. And then I decide that maybe this shape, maybe we should change the colors. We'll make one purple, one pink. There we go. So let's say I decide, oh, I want to move this purple one over to the beginning. I could drag this, try and knock it to the back, grab the pink one. Oops. See, that's how hard this is. I'm going to undo all that. I don't want to have to do that every time. Move these shapes around, drag them around, try and reposition them just to change the order of how they're laid out. So what I can do is I'll take these three shapes, I'll create a group, and this is where those layers come in handy. Now I'm grouping this content together into one unit. So now they're together in group 4. I have all 3 rectangles up there. If I turn on a stack, it's going to default me to a horizontal stack. It sees these 3 elements in a horizontal line with a spacing of 33 pixels. So now that I'm in a stack, I can easily adjust my spacing across the whole thing. I can also select the group and hold S, adjust one spacing, or hold Shift and S and adjust everything together. But where the real magic is here with stacks is I can take this rectangle and now just swap it and everything's going to adjust for me. So that's oh, a really handy tool. Now, if we take a look at padding, padding kind of works hand in hand with stacks, and we're going to keep it simple, but you can get really advanced with how you combine all of your elements. Excuse me. So if we take this shape again and paste it down here, and let's say we borrow some of the text, and we're just going to put in a title. And let's make this more of a button just for example. So if I just had a button laid out like this, it's often that I'm going to reuse a button and change the label on the button across my design. So here, if I was to just resize or change this label, we'll center the text and say longer label. Now I've broken my button. The background hasn't adjusted with the text. I could go in and easily resize this and use some of the Adobe measurement tools here. So if I hold Alt or Option, it'll show me relative measurements, but I don't want to have to go and update that every single time. So what I can do is, once again, I'll group that into a group and I'll call this my button just for visibility. And now if I turn on padding, that's going to measure that same space that's between the text and the background, and it's going to keep that consistent. So if I was to go and make this an even, found a bug, longer label, you can see that the whole thing spreads out and adjusts with my text. So as I come back to save, my button has adjusted. So padding is really handy for creating dynamic elements that adjust to the content within them. That's kind of the takeaway with padding. All right, that's just layout. There's a lot you can do with layout. So next, some basics on styling. So XD is a vector tool. It has connections into things like Creative Cloud libraries, which work across all of your Creative Cloud and allow you to kind of save graphics, save colors, save character styles and typography, and use them within your design. So in this case, if we zoom in, again, we're just going to go off basic rectangles today. If I go to this color picker and select a color, I can just pick a color from a page. I can also pick a color from, say, Julia's background on Zoom, a really great color there. I can easily apply this to any shape. And like I showed you before, I can do copy and I can paste style, paste appearance across shapes, which is really handy. This also works on text styling. And I can do things like saving this color into the color picker. But that color picker color is really basic and it just applies the swatch to any shape I apply. So if I drop this in here, go to my color picker and apply that once again, that's great. That color's there. But if I want to change this color and apply it to everywhere that color is applied, I can't do that from this color picker. So that's where our assets panel comes in. So let's say, I'm going to pick a better color here. Let's say we have a blue and our brand is blue. And so we have this blue element that we want to show up across our website. Now I could save it here, but what I'm going to do now that it's applied here is I'm just going to click plus up top in my document assets to add this into my color panel. Now you can see, like I did with the gradient, I can double click on this and name this blue. So let's say we have a fictional brand called Bart's Blueberries. We'll call this Blueberry Blue. So now we have our Blueberry Blue, and we can apply this to other shapes. So just like we did down in that color picker, I can select this shape, but now when I click on this blue, I've applied Bart's Blueberry Blue to this shape, and great. Now I've got two shapes with Blueberry Blue. I'm going to stop saying that. But let's say Bart decides to go into the grape business and the blue needs to change a little bit. If I go in, I can now edit that value for the key color and say, well, we're going to make this just a little bit more purple to match the grape theme. Now, everywhere that Blueberry Blue is applied is now the updated color. So imagine you've designed out 100 pages of a website, you've got all this brand applied, and you need to now adjust the Blueberry Blue to a grape purple. You can do that by using the assets panel really easily. Okay, so that's colors. You can also do this to character style. So let's say this is my main header style. I can copy this. It's going to give me the style it is, but I can double click and say, this is going to be header 1. And I can do that for all of my character styles, add them in. And then whenever I want to apply that, I can just click and it's going to apply that style. So that's a really handy way of working and kind of managing it. Once you get to the point, and we won't dive into this, you can now publish a file. So once you've saved all these assets, kind of designed a structure for your design or pattern library, you can then save it as a library, use it across all of your Creative Cloud apps, use it across different XD files. And so you only have to kind of design the style or the brand once, and then you can use it across different projects. So hopefully we're all caught up on that. I'm going to dive into some basic shape styling as well. And then we'll move on. So that's colors and topography, pretty straightforward. Here we go. Would you usually make an artboard within the comp with all the styles in order to add them to the assets panel? Yeah, so there's some different ways you can do it. And it'll probably depend on the type of project you're doing. So if you're working in, say, a product team, you might have one central file that's acting as your library, or multiple files. You might have one for icons, one for components, and one for color maybe, or they're all housed in one file. And then that's feeding out to different files that you're working in. You could, if you're working on a simpler project, or maybe just doing some brand work, maybe you have it all in one artboard. And what's really cool, I don't really have anything here that's super complex, but if you select a slide or an artboard, you can hit plus and it's going to add all the colors from that artboard. And in this case, it just added white because that's the only additional element. But if you've designed out your site and you have all the styles on there, you can just click add on character styles and color, and it's going to extract all of those for you. So that's another way to do it. You don't really have to document it, but if you do want to document it, you can. Hopefully that answers that. Okay, so going back to appearance, I have some basic controls. So I have these different shape controls and I can edit them all independently. So if I bring in a polygon, I have some on canvas controls that can help me change kind of border radius of colors or of shapes, round them out, sharpen them up. On polygons, I have this other control that changes kind of the, I don't know what you call it, the indent of shapes or how many sides it has. I can also control that in the panel and easily create things like gears. And there's a handy little shortcut for Valentine's Day where you can quickly create a heart in the polygon tool. Now, if you're doing styling, that's all great. That's appearance. You can change the opacity not only with the slider, and this is changing the opacity on the entire shape or group or element that you have selected. There's also opacity in the colors. So definitely can do some creative things with those two. But on this opacity control, you can use your number keys on the keyboard to quickly change your opacity. So if I use 9, that's going to make it 90%, 8, 80, 7, 70, etc. And I can easily control the opacity of my shape just using my keys. The drop down below that is blending mode. So if you've used Photoshop at all, these would look familiar, or Illustrator. And these are really just for adding a bit more advanced graphic control. So if you have an image underneath a shape or a shape underneath an image, you can kind of blend these together using your opacity and create some cool effects. So if you want to do like a color overlay on an image, you can mess around with these. We won't dive into those today. These are your border radius controls. So you can do independent border radius control, and you would just select this, change the number, and then you can curve one corner. You can also do that using the option key and just dragging on one if you want to do it on canvas. You have simple border controls. So once that's toggled on, you can change kind of the positioning of the border, whether it's centered outside, whether it's round or square, and what the corners look like as well on the border. And then these eyedroppers help you just select the colors that you want to apply. So if I make that bigger, you can see that having that effect. And then finally, we get down into shadows. So we have our inner shadow, which is great for creating some depth inside of a shape, and then a drop shadow, which is probably the most common. And you can change the opacity. The B is kind of your spread or distance away from the shape. And then you can change your X and Y positioning. And so this is just kind of where the shadow casts around the shape. And one fun little Easter egg, even though we don't have time for it, is something called 3D transform. So overall, XD is a 2D shape or 2D canvas. But you can create the illusion of 3D clicking on this little cube in the transform section. And when I do that, I'm gifted with this gizmo, and that's the technical name for it. And it has these little 3D arrows and a kind of a depth control. So when I highlight these and play with them, I get some 3D mock perspective. So I can easily kind of create some perspective, twist this around, and even pull it forward and back in space. Really handy if you're doing anything with AR or VR. Kind of like virtual reality stuff, you can bend your design into a view. But yeah, that's our appearance and styling. I'm gonna go back. One thing we forgot was responsive resize, and we're not gonna really have a great demonstration of it here today, but we're gonna get into it. And this is enabled pretty much by default on any group or element. So to show you, I'll just create a simple little layout here. Let's pretend that this is, say, a website. So we have like a header, really bad header, just roughly roughed in here. And let's say this is a tablet view. If I wanted to go down to a mobile view, you can see here on the right, responsive resize is automatically turned on. I can turn it on and off, but with it turned on, I can easily resize the shape, and it's going to kind of calculate all of the elements on the page for me. So let me just add in one more shape here to demonstrate what it's doing. I'm going to pull in a square down here and kind of make it like a chat button maybe. So now it's all in here, and as I resize, that button's going to stay fixed to the right and adjust. So I can go from a tablet view down to, say, a mobile view really easily using responsive resize. So that's one of the other layout controls that we'll dive into a bit more as we go. Okay, vector editing, I'll touch on really quickly. We can come back to that later, and then we'll touch on prototyping basics as well. So I'm going to grab this shape. So all of the shapes here that you're using on the left toolbar, as you draw them in, they're shapes. What you can do is, as soon as you open those up to edit them, which you can do by clicking enter, you're turning them into a vector path. And at the basis, this is all vector tooling. So is Figma, so is Illustrator. They're all vector tools, which means that they can be scaled up and they don't like rasterize or change their appearance like you might see in Photoshop, which is more pixel based, and you can't scale things up in quite the same way. They're not scalable graphics. That was probably a really confusing, simple explanation. Hopefully it came out clear. But as I double click or enter into a shape here in XD, I can now start manipulating how that shape appears. And so if I click here, you can see I can add a point to any side here on the shape, and I can just click and resize, move that around. And so now I have a little house and a very uneven house. But what I can do is I can change the curvature of those points and create more curved shapes. And so if I was to do that, I could double click on a shape and automatically create a curvature. And then as I bend it, I have this kind of symmetrical resizing across the two arms of the vector point. If I double click, I go back to a square point. Now, in the case where you want some independent control, if you hold Alt or Option on your keyboard, you can then control one arm at a time and adjust it accordingly. So that's just a little tip and trick on how to use the vector editing. Once you've opened up a path, it becomes a vector path and it won't default back to the original shape. So you'll see as I use a rectangle here, I have some different controls than I do here. No, I don't. Yes, I do. Just the border radius goes away. So once I convert it to a path, I can't change the border radius because this is now a vector path and not just a rectangle. Oh, the voice is going to hang in there. I promise. Okay. So any questions so far on the design basics, layout, styling, the interface itself? I don't think we have any new questions. I think we've got them all on the way. Okay. And thank you, Julia, for sharing all those resources. Definitely check those out. Yeah, those all look great. Atomic design. And we'll leverage some of these resources and concepts as we go through and build out a project. But I want to quickly talk about prototyping mode because this is going to come in handy too. We're going to do kind of 2 sessions covering it because there's a lot that you can do with prototyping. And really where I see the most value here in XD is bringing your designs to life. You can lay out shapes in a lot of different apps. You can't make them interactive as easily as you can in XD in many. So XD really, I think, leads the way in terms of setting up that interactivity. So to get started, we want to flip over to prototype mode. And these also have shortcuts. So it's option 2, 3, and 1. So you can just kind of rotate through these different modes as you're designing. Now, there's 2 different elements, and we didn't really need separate slides here, but why not? So prototyping works based on triggers. So your inputs like mouse clicks, drags, voice commands, and time. And then it creates action. So that's things like translating, dissolving, sliding up and down, things that you're probably used to in like a PowerPoint presentation or Apple Keynote. Some of those prototyping behaviors are kind of similar. And so first we need a trigger that's going to trigger an action. And then we can loop things, we can get creative with how they transition. But one of the magical pieces of Adobe XD is AutoAnimate. And this allows us to kind of move elements and morph them in a really smooth way between positions in artboards and component states, which we won't touch on today, but we'll get to. So the basics of this, let's say, we'll just bring back our trusty rectangle. We'll give it some style here. And we turn off the border. So in this case, we'll just use these 2 screens. So let's say this is my starting point and I want to set up my ending point. Now, all I want to do is when I click on this rectangle, it's going to get bigger. And I just use Shift and Alt Option to resize everything symmetrically in the same center. And so here, what I'm going to do is I just want a simple click on the rectangle to make it expand. So in prototype mode, I'll select the rectangle and you'll see I get this blue arrow. I can do a couple different things. The most basic is I can click on it and drag it to where I want it to go, which is this second artboard. Once I do that and let go, it's going to snap to that artboard. Now you're going to see a new contextual menu on the right-hand side called interaction and action. So think of interaction, this is your trigger, and then action is how the action is going to behave. So tap is the one we want for this. We also could drag on the rectangle. We could use keyboard and game controller inputs, which is great if you're doing game design. And then we can also use voice controls. So things like, hey Siri, oh, I should be careful. My watch doesn't turn on, or my phone. But you can use these voice commands to prototype out voice interactions as well. So we're going to leave it on tap. And then our action here is going to be AutoAnimate. We could use a basic transition like a PowerPoint. And then there's all of these other ones, which are for more advanced prototyping, which we'll get to. So we're just going to stick with AutoAnimate. We can change things like easing. And this is kind of how something goes through its motion. So if you use ease in and out, which I'm going to use, it's going to like ramp up the motion and then ramp it down. If you use ease in, it's going to ramp up, but then just stop kind of abruptly. And then we have some other ones. Let's actually use snap. So snap just has a different curvature in how the motion moves. And you can change the duration of this as well. So we'll just bump it up a little bit so it's more visible. And now when we hit play, if I click on that rectangle, you're going to see it expand up into the rectangle. Pretty straightforward. Now I can also set this to come back, and XD will kind of remember the settings I have. So as I drag this out, it's going to apply all the same settings. So now when I hit play, I can just kind of click snap and bounce back and forth between this rectangle. Really basic. But when you think about it, things like this can be applied to floating action buttons or photos that you want to zoom in kind of like a light box or shadow box kind of setup. So this behavior can be used quite a bit. This can also apply to a larger bundle of shapes. So let's say we take this actions down, and let's just say we want to kind of morph these circles around We'll rotate them a little bit. And all I'm doing, the basic premise is you want to set your start, which is this one, and your end states, and kind of create how you want it to look in the end. So I'm just twisting around these shapes, moving them around to get how I want it to look. Let's just move this over here. Now what we're going to do is all of these circles or decorations are in different positions on the two slides. And I could set up a tap like I did before, but on artboards, you can use something called time. So in prototype mode, I'm just going to drag this little arrow to the next artboard. And this time we see time as an option. And time is great if you're trying to create delays between things or auto progressing animation. So if you're doing a presentation, you might want something to auto advance. So you can use time and you can set the delay. Now in this case, we're just going to set it to 0 and we're going to change this behavior of AutoAnimate to ease in and out. And we'll just set this up to 1 second. Let's actually make it 2 seconds. So we get a bit more of a flow between animations. Now, at this point, this is just going to animate for 2 seconds and move over here. I want to create a loop. So I'm going to bring this back and it's going to apply the same settings that I just set up. So now when I hit play, you're going to see these shapes kind of start moving back and forth in an ease in and ease out pattern. So this is a really simple way to use AutoAnimate to create some motion in your designs. And as we get into more advanced stuff, we're going to show you how you can bring in video and Lottie and really expand on your prototyping, but that's towards the end. So hopefully everyone's been able to follow along. I'm going to point out one more thing that we'll talk about eventually and highlight share mode. And this is plugins. So XD's got a great feature set, but there's a lot of extensions that you can use to really expand on your design. So one, if you want some free illustrations, you can use Undraw. This is a plugin. You can copy and paste. You can search for things and bring them into your design. And there's a whole plethora of, if I can get the window onto the right screen, whole plethora of plugins available for XD, from icons to placeholder faces, lorem ipsum, icons, which are going to be really handy as we build something out. A quick mockup we'll talk about. There's a whole bunch of these plugins that can help add in functionality to XD, depending on what you're doing. So if you're bored and you want to click around and see what plugins are available, click on the little Lego block at the bottom, and then hit plus up top in this panel, and you'll be able to search for plugins. Now, a quick note on sharing. Sharing allows you to build different links that you can send out to your audience. You can give it a link. And we have a few different types, and these all change how the share link is viewed. So everything from development handoff, which we'll talk about at the end, to presentations, to user testing. There's all these different handy links you can send your designs out with, and you can update them as your project goes along. So you're going to see us use this early on to generate a link as we're in, say, a wireframe stage and start gathering feedback on it. And then as we get that feedback and make changes throughout the progress, we can just keep updating that link, and everyone who has the link can keep seeing the updates. So this is a really handy tool as well. And I know we're at 9 o'clock here, so, or 9 o'clock on the East Coast, 7 o'clock there, I guess. We can wrap up and turn to questions if you want. I think I covered everything. We got plugins, we got Learn Hub. We didn't really touch on stock and icons, but you can look at icons in the plugins. I also use some paid icon packs, but there's so many different icon packs you can use that kind of fit the style you want to use. For this course, we'll probably use a plugin like free icons, and just bring them in. Or Google has a great set of material icons you can use. And then in terms of stock imagery, and fonts, Adobe has a couple of great resources. Adobe Stock, which has 70,000 free assets that you can download. And there's a number of free fonts too that you can use and connect into your Adobe XD. So we'll use those as well. Yeah, I think we've covered pretty much all the basics. Any more? I see Kyle has a question here. In responsive resizing, can the element snap to center when on mobile instead of staying on the side like the chat button? So yeah, you do have control on responsive resize. It's down here. It's pretty simple. So you're not necessarily setting a set of breakpoints. It's really just for quickly reorganizing things. So in this case, like if I turned on responsive resize for this artboard, because all of these elements are center aligned, it's going to keep them center aligned. I can easily go into an element and click on manual here and change its pinning. So if I wanted it to be fixed relative to the right, I can do that. And now when I do this, you're going to see it moves off center because it's pinned to the right based on that starting point. So there isn't any explicit breakpoints at this point for setting like, these are my mobile, these are my tablet. Responsive resize is really just for like quickly, again, like working through iteration stages, moving that content around. Hopefully that answers it for you, Kyle. Yeah, any other questions on this introduction? I have one more question for all of you before we wrap up, and that is the theme of the project that we want to tackle. So I do want to keep this simple, and I've got kind of 3 general themes, and once we pick one, we'll carry forward on that maybe for the rest of the project. You can, of course, dabble in your own theme, but all of the guidance, all the things we'll be building in these subsequent sessions will be themed around that. And so the first one is a coffee app. We'll kind of keep them all simple and fairly accessible to everyone. So a coffee app, we can define what that is later on. But because we're also in Alberta, we can talk hiking app or outdoors app of some sort. And then the third is the always entertaining pancake finder app, a staple of the Stampede. So maybe in the chat, vote with either a tree for hiking, a coffee cup for coffee, or pancake emoji for pancakes. And let's just see where everyone wants to focus. And I think we have questions about recording. Julia and Louise.
I will leave that to Louise to answer.
Okay.
And it's looking like we have a clear winner.
A lot of coffee so far. Okay. All right. Well, coffee it might be, which is good because there's a lot of stock assets for coffee. And I guess I didn't specify what type of tree. Any tree works. The beech is also a good tree. Okay. Yeah, any final questions? Anything you want me to take a closer look at here? I know we're potentially over time. Yeah, power issues at live. Uh-oh. Uh-oh, we lost the live audience. Cool. All right, well, maybe we'll wrap it up there then. It looks like we're going with coffee. Maybe we can add in some hiking themed coffee for the hiking enthusiasts in the group. But with that, I think our next session is next week, same time, I believe, unless anyone corrects me. So we'll see you then.
Thank you, everyone.